Hello and good morning, dear Minister Chen Wei-ling, dear Director Chen Xiquan, dear honored participants and guests. It's a great honor for me to speak here at this prestigious event and in front of such an excellent audience. I was asked to speak about Japan's framework for the digital transformation. Obviously, I'm not Japanese, but I've been living in Japan for many years. I've been working on Japan. I'm an economist by background and working on Japan for more than 20 years. In fact, Professor Tsunami would be much more in a position to to say this as an insider, but I think an outside perspective might also have its merits. What I'd like to do is, of course, it's a huge topic and you cannot do justice to it within 40 minutes. I will give you an overview and I'll give you, of course, my take on what Japan is trying to achieve. To do so, I will start by introducing the Japanese context, which is, I think, very important in order to appreciate the various goals and initiatives. And then I will talk about the vision, the aspirations, to what extent they are founded, what I think the positive aspects, the opportunities that Japan is trying to realize. And then, of course, we also need to talk about some obstacles. The Japanese context, relevant for Society 5.0, to understand Society 5.0, is first of all, demographics. The most dominant trend that is not only influencing the course of Japanese economy, but also society, politics at large. And from this trend follows a very urgent imperative, and that is growth through productivity increase. As the society, as the population of Japan is no longer growing, but declining, the only way to sustain the aging population is a productivity increase. Now let us look at this, and I put it in comparison with the German numbers. You can see the population development in Japan. It's nicely shaped. You can see that the growth of the Japanese economy was well supported by population growth, but the peak has already been reached in 2012, and now the population, if nothing else happens, the population will decline almost as fast as it increased in the last 50 years. And in Germany, on the other hand, the development is relatively stable. At least in terms of total population, because Germany also is concerned about aging. And here you see on the second slide, you see the figures for aging. And again, Japan is much more dramatic than the German case. I have two groups, the share of the plus 65 population and the share of the plus 75 population. The share of the plus 75 population, that's the population group that are likely to be in need of elderly care at some stage. And as you can see, the forecast up to 2060 in Japan, by 2060, more than 1/3 of the population will be 65 plus. And you see the 75 plus, 1 out of 4 people will be 75 plus if the development continues in this way. We cannot imagine how a society will work under these conditions. Germany has a similar course, but it's less pronounced as in the Japanese case. So demographic means that Japan needs to focus on productivity increases. First of all, why? Because labor is becoming scarce and the proportion of the elderly population no longer in work is going to increase, and it has to be supported by a smaller workforce. And on the other hand as well, of course, you have the demographic situation, not only on a national level, but also on a regional level. Already now you have areas in Japan, super aged regions, and where people, especially younger people, are leaving. And the question is how to sustain lifelines in depopulated, super aged regions. And of course, there's the big challenge in terms of healthcare and elderly care needs that need to be secured and that also need to be financed. So the imperative is productivity increase. And here, again, I contrast this with the development of Germany and also put it in relation to the United States. If we look at the GDP per hour worked and set the level in the US equal 100, then we see the nice catch up that both Germany and Japan achieved up to the early 1990s. Quite parallel, although there is a gap of about 30 percentage points between Japan and Germany, but there was a very strong catch up in productivity, labor productivity, GDP per hour worked. But this stopped in the 90s, early 90s. In Japan, there was the burst of the so-called bubble economy. In Germany, we had to cope with unification. Actually, both countries lost in relative terms vis-à-vis the United States that recovered in this period. And but Germany regained its strength and closed the gap in 2017, whereas Japan is still lingering on, and GDP per hour is 30% below, more than 30% below the US and the German level, and it's even below the OECD average. The positive side of it, of course, is there's a huge potential. Having this gap, if you can close this gap, this would mean a 30% increase in GDP per head, if you can manage that. But of course, the question is how, and that's a big issue confronting the Japanese economy. Now, in this context, of course, there are huge expectations with regard to technology, and the most fundamental new technology around is the digitalization, the digital transformation, connectivity, big data, artificial intelligence, and more. So Japan came up with the concept of Society 5.0, the concept of a super smart society. And why 5.0? Germany had Industry 4.0, now Japan 5.0. Well, there's the fifth kind of social civilization, from the hunter-gatherer to the agrarian society, industrial society, information society, now the super smart society. So it's the fifth stage of human social organization. And of course, all these stages are characterized by a certain technological regime. And the new technological regime for the super smart society is the digital, the cyber, or let's say the integration that is envisaged within Society 5.0, the perfectly connected, highly efficient, and inclusive society that fully integrates the cyber and the physical world seamlessly. And of course, it is data-driven. Data are the new fundamental resource, in this super smart society. So that's the image, the vision that Japan envisages with the concept of Society 5.0. It's all about technology, of course. And this technology, in a way, is supposed to solve many of the issues and the problems that Japan, but not only Japan, is facing. So the idea is that with the data and the sharing of data and the processing of data into information, useful information, and the enhancement of knowledge through this process, that new values can be created, new solutions can be found to resolve social issues, the social issues especially confronted by an aging society, to enhance the physical skills for people on the shop floor, but also to enhance the analytical skills of those who are doing mental work. So that's the idea, the high expectations that are based on this framework. So the whole idea of Society 5.0 was introduced in the context of the 5th Science and Technology Plan that the Council for Science and Technology and Innovation published in 2016. It's a 5-year plan that outlines, of course, major research projects, and of course it allocates budgets to these projects, within this framework. And it was immediately taken up by the Prime Minister of Japan and his cabinet, who annually lay out the growth strategy for Japan, the strategy for revitalizing the Japanese economy, as it was called recently. So in 2017 and 2018, Society 5.0, the concept framework, became to figure prominently in this strategy. And then a very important actor, of course, on the government side is the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, METI, and they also, with their new industrial structure, the New Industrial Structure Committee, which is advising METI, they also incorporated Society 5.0 quite quickly into their future vision towards 2030s. That not enough. Beyond the government, Keidanren, the Japanese Business Federation, also incorporated the concept and published in 2017 a policy paper on the realization of Society 5.0. So you could see that this framework, which started with the 5th Science Technology Plan, was soon taken up not only by other branches of the government, but also by the private sector, as exemplified by the policy paper of Keidanren. And of course now there are lots of initiatives, follow-ups on this in this area. One interesting initiative, because as I said before, Society 5.0 is going to be data-driven society. So where are the data? How can they be used? An initiative, recent initiative by the National Strategy Office of ICT, which is also associated with the cabinet. They came up with a plan of a user-centered information bank where private personnel information would be collected under the under the umbrella of the government. Why the government? Because the government feels that they have the trust, people will trust if the government is collecting these data and managing and storing these data it's easier to gain trust than if there is a private initiative. Of course, there are private initiatives as well, and of course private platforms in Japan where lots of data are collected, but this is a new attempt, and it is focusing on personal data. And there are other initiatives by non-governmental organizations who focus on the morals or the ethics of artificial intelligence, the initiatives for responsible development of AI, a group of researchers from different disciplines who gathered and also publish policy statements in this area. And as already mentioned, the G20 summit, which Japan is hosting, Japan is also planning here, preparing guidelines for international guidelines for the development, human-centered development of AI. Actually, this is not something that came out of the blue. Japan has, of course, a strong background in ICT, and that goes back to the 1980s even. Even before or with the advent of the internet, the idea of ubiquitous computing was also promoted in Japan, and a prominent figure in this field is Professor Sakamura from then the University of Tokyo. He's now with Toyo University. Then you might remember the first mobile internet service was launched in Japan by NTT Docomo, iMode. In 2000, that was in the early 2000s. In 2013, the Japanese government declared that it would want Japan to become the world's most advanced IT nation. So very ambitious goals here. And then when Germany came up with its concept of Industry 4.0, Japan was shaken and frightened and thought, what's happening here? We also have to respond. We have to create similar platforms and consortia and initiatives, and they did come up with several of them, which also reflects, of course, their background in different technology areas. So there was the Robot Revolution Initiative started in 2015, Industrial Value Chain Initiative in 2015, and the IoT Acceleration Consortium that was launched in 2016 by different actors, but all with the idea to promote connectivity and to promote the generation and analysis of data in order to improve the efficiency of production processes. So you can see there's a lot of momentum, a lot of actors, a lot of initiatives, and I would like now to try some kind of assessment as to what extent I think that these initiatives can be successful, and on the other hand, what kind of obstacles they are facing. First of all, the interesting concept of Society 5.0 is that it places technology and innovation explicitly in a social context. Technology is there to serve the solution of social problems, social issues. And Japan, interesting, says that we will have to take a lead in this digital transformation because we are facing the most pressing needs. We confront challenges that make it essential, imperative, that we develop this technology in order to cope with these challenges. The labor shortage, challenges related above all to demographic change, which is, of course, implies labor shortage, rising healthcare, elderly care needs and costs, and providing smart mobility, smart energy solutions to the regions in Japan. So one aspect is that we can do this, and we will take a lead because we are confronting these very severe issues much more than other nations do. So out of this urgency to act, Japan expects to be a leader in the field. Then, on the other hand, related also to the demographic challenge, of course, the productivity revolution, a new growth stimulus that one hopes to result from the digital transformation. And there's the other aspect that the system, the Japanese system, that's also related, of course, to productivity, needs to reform itself, and the new technology and the structural adjustments that go along with introducing and advancing the new technology, that these structural adjustments are also beneficial for Japan, for the needed reforms, like work style reforms, but also stimulating entrepreneurship. And the upcoming 2020 Tokyo Olympics and Paralympics are seen as a catalyst, an additional motivation to speed up the development and to concentrate the resources in developing the new solutions in an even shorter period of time. So the Tokyo Olympics are seen as a catalyst, but also a showcase to show, Japan wants to show the world how far it has transformed, how far the digital transformation has occurred in this country. And one example is supposed to be the next generation of mobile communication, the 5G generation that Japan also wants, where Japan also wants to take a leading role, and which of course is also at the center, it's an infrastructure at the center of big data and the digital transformation. Japan also is very optimistic, and I think it has good reason to be optimistic, to take a leading role here because of its strength in manufacturing. A lot of applications, I mean the concept of Industry 4.0 promoted by Germany. Germany as well, like Japan, has a strong manufacturing base, and so the idea here is to utilize this base and to promote the digital transformation. For further factory automation, optimization of material flows, supply chain integration, remote quality control. Japanese companies have machines, as they are very strong in machine tools, but also for example, construction vehicles. And these vehicles are distributed all over the world. And they need maintenance. And how to do this maintenance? Through remote control, GPS remote control and other devices. And there's also the expectation that digitalization will simplify the handling of machines. So you need to invest less in the training of employees. Whether this is beneficial for society is another question, but it's definitely a solution to the labor shortage in Japan. Actually, in many countries, there's a big discussion about the impact of the digital transformation on labor and work. Japan says, we see this in a positive way because we are suffering from labor shortage, so we expect the substitution effect that many other economies are afraid of. We actually welcome it. We can welcome it. There's less resistance in Japan against these implications from the new technology because Japan is facing these extreme labor shortages. So in that sense, simplification of machine handling is something that is welcome. And of course, people point to the fact that Japan has a lot of data, and these are not personal, individual data, these are machine data. So it's much easier to handle, not so many privacy issues involved. And so they also have sufficient testing field to develop intelligent solutions in this area. Then, apart from, or related to manufacturing, the strong manufacturing base, Japan is a leader in many core technologies that are at the center, the core of the digital transformation. One area, of course, is robotics, sensor technology. Without sensors, there will be no data. So the quality of sensors is important. And Japan is a leader in the field of sensor technology, actuator technology, to communicate with sleeping devices, wake them up and say, communicate. Also Japan is leading. The area of biotechnology, also an area where extreme rich new data, of course, are to be generated. Human interface technology, online gaming, material nanotechnology, light quantum technology, all these are areas that the papers, the policy papers published by the government and Keidanren, they stress Japan's strength in this area and are optimistic that Japan can leverage its leading role in these technology fields to also take a lead in the digital transformation towards a society 5.0. Last but not least, Japan's advanced ICT infrastructure. That's something maybe not so impressive in Asia, but when you come from Europe or you come from Germany, you are always impressed by the quality, for example, of the mobile network in Japan, where you can, even in Germany, it's difficult to make a phone call while you're on the train. In Japan, technically you can make a phone call on the train, but you're not allowed. So you're not allowed to speak on the train. But in Japan, even if we were allowed, we couldn't. Because the net is not, the coverage is limited. And so you can also if you look at OECD data, the fiber connections, broadband subscriptions, or the density of broadband mobile subscriptions is among the highest in the OECD, and also the cloud service infrastructure is already widely diffused across businesses. Almost half of the business in Japan use some kind of cloud service. It's the highest share next to Finland and Sweden. So there is this infrastructure. So we can see there are a lot of conditions where we could say, well, Japan will certainly play a major role in the digital transformation, maybe a leader in some areas. But there are also obstacles. And they are not negligible. I'm not going into detail, but I want to pick three main areas. One is, although Japan is now, there are signs of a growing, evolving entrepreneurial or startup ecosystem, especially in Tokyo, still there's a low level of entrepreneurship and intrapreneurship within organizations. So this is related to the low social acceptance of failure. If you fail in business, people will not think, well, bad luck, the circumstances, but there will be some personal attribution. And of course, that's not beneficial. That doesn't support risk-taking among especially younger people. Also, the corporate culture at least in the large organizations, the corporate culture is not fostering risk-taking. It's relatively conservative, especially in the older organizations where the founder family is no longer present. Of course, in Japan, you also have very strong founders, entrepreneurs. You look at Rakuten, the e-commerce, the Japanese version of Amazon. Rakuten, Mr. Mikitani, he's an entrepreneur. Or look at SoftBank, a little older company. but with Masayoshi Son, he's a very strong leader, strong entrepreneur, or even in other areas, Mr. Yanai from Uniqlo Fast Retailing, very strong entrepreneur. But many Japanese companies are now third, fourth generation, and they are salaryman organizations. And there, you see in many cases a lack of leadership, strong consensus orientation, which is slowing down decision making. Then you have strong organizational boundaries. In the political system, although 20 years ago, Japan reformed its public administration in order to better coordinate across ministries, policy initiatives across ministries, and the institute CRIPS, which Mr. Tsunami is part of, is also part of this attempt to coordinate policies across ministries. And the Cabinet Office has become very strong in arranging this sort of cross-boundary coordination of policy initiatives. But still there's a strong, when Japanese say the tatewari, the vertical structure in the government, silo thinking within the government. But you see a similar phenomena in large organizations. And there's a nice passage in the biography of Steve Jobs, a nice chapter asking, why didn't Sony develop iTunes? Sony had everything in-house. And Steve Jobs had to go around and coordinate with different players in different industries. And he managed, although he didn't have everything in-house. Sony had everything in-house. Why didn't they do it? Why couldn't they achieve iTunes? And the answer was, well, because of the silos within the organization, that the different business units were not able to effectively communicate. And that, of course, relates to a weak leadership on the top. There's also the problem of lack of mobility of resources across organizations, because still Japan, especially large organizations, they rely on in-house careers. So there's no mobility of human capital from one organization to another to cross-fertilize, to bring in outside perspectives and to help bridge organizational boundaries. And related to this, there's a low level of industry-university collaboration. So, of course, in a digitalized, connected society, you need to overcome these boundaries. And it is essential to achieve the goals of connectivity. It's not about finding solutions within organizations. You need to create new infrastructures. You need to come up with new standards. And this is only possible by cross-organizational coordination and collaboration. And there Japan might face special difficulties. And another aspect, of course, is internationalization. There's a lot of talk about Silicon Valley, even also in China, of course, the vibrant startup ecosystem. A lot is influenced through international mobility. In Silicon Valley wouldn't be Silicon Valley without all the people from India and other parts of Asia going there. Yeah, it's attractive. Now Berlin is a hotspot for entrepreneurship. Why? Because lots of international people from outside go into Berlin. And that's something that is not happening yet in Japan and in Tokyo. So this is also exemplified by the low level of FDI. Japan is at the bottom within the OECD with regard to the foreign direct investment, inward foreign direct investment into Japan. It's much lower than in other OECD countries. Also, whereas Japan is a strong leader in technology, and it's the world champion when it comes to applying for global patents, Japan is little involved in trading technology. So there's the trade, the cross-border trade of technology is relatively small. That's also when you look at other statistics like co-inventions in international patents, again, Japan is at the bottom of the list. And also, of course, knowledge workers. Japan is not a mecca for knowledge workers, although these people would find excellent conditions there. I mean, there is a lot of knowledge around. But somehow Japan is not able to attract these skilled workers. So there are some issues here that definitely need to be addressed and resolved if Japan wants to move ahead with the realization of a society 5.0. Now let me come up and conclude, and as I was told, I mean, people would maybe like to ask questions and or hear more about specific topics. Let me conclude. Society 5.0 is definitely a comprehensive framework, more comprehensive than anything that has been out there. It goes beyond Industry 4.0 that the German government proposed. And it's issue-driven. It puts social issues at the center and sees technology as an instrument, a tool that is there to be used to solve social problems. So Japan is trying with Society 5.0, as I put it here, turning crisis into opportunity. So the demographic challenge and the productivity imperative are seen as, from sort of giving the whole movement, the whole concept, an important momentum. Japan is a country, and here that's something in contrast maybe to the discussions, many discussions in Germany or continental Europe. Japan is fully embracing the technology. They don't ignore the risks, but they are confident that the risk can be controlled and that technology can be used to the better of society. So in that sense, Japan takes a very optimistic stance. And as I tried to explain, Japan has excellent initial conditions, the manufacturing base, the technology base, but also the human resources in Japan, the existing infrastructures, in addition to the needs that need to be solved, give Japan a good foundation. There are good prospects that Japan will play a leading role in this digital transformation. But as I also pointed out, there are some constraints and obstacles on the social side, in terms of business organization, in terms of culture, mindset, that need to be overcome in order to fully exploit the potential that Japan has. So thank you very much for your attention.
Hi, I'm Margaret, and I work for the Institute for Information Industry. We serve as a think tank of the government. I have two questions regarding to data. So my first question is that you mentioned about a personal data bank of Japan and the accountability of the government. I would like to know about the opinion from you, especially about the accountability of the government. And the second question is like, when EU has GDPR, what's your opinion for the Asian countries to have regional cooperations of data regulations? Especially, what's the base for that? Like maybe regarding to some obstacles that you've mentioned in your slides. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very important question. Well, the personal information data bank, that it's still a conceptual framework. Japan, as I mentioned, has a lot of industrial data. Yeah, there are lots of data from production processes, but it definitely feels it has a lack of personal data, and it wants to especially use the personal data in the context of health and elderly care. So they are concrete fields of application. And of course, also maybe establish some kind of incentive system to, the concept of nudging, to have people lead people to a healthier lifestyle. And all this is, of course, based on personal, having access to personal data, analyzing huge amounts of personal data. Other things are, of course, evidence-based policy making should also benefit from this. So I think the government is not, of course, the whole thing will be done by companies. It's not the government the government is offering the framework, and the government is offering the legal structure and the guarantees in order to persuade people to participate. Now, there's an interesting precedent. Japan a few years ago introduced for the first time at all a nationwide ID system. There was no ID system in Japan before. So the My Number system was introduced a few years ago as a general ID system for tax and social security. And the My Number system goes along with a My Number card, which is voluntary. Citizens can apply for a My Number card that makes it more easy to show others their ID. No? So you have the ID, but the card is voluntary. Now the acceptance of the My Number card has been low, and the government has been disappointed by why people shy away from having this card. It should be so convenient, and there have been lots of ideas what other data you could put on the card and make it so easy to share and transfer information. So now people are trying to think on how to give people more incentive to use the card, to apply for the card and receive the card. Of course, there has also been some problems with the delivery, but so the Japanese people are a little bit reluctant, and that might, so the optimism of Japan is that just because the government does it, the data will be there, will be freely provided, is maybe too optimistic if we see the example of the My Number card. No? That's one point. The other one, the GDPR. Well, Europe, that's the power of the EU is that it's such a size, such a big market, so they can think up any kind of regulation and then say that's going to be the global standard. I'm not sure whether it makes a lot of sense to. I think for me the most natural reaction, and that has of course happened, that Japan's system has been acknowledged within the GDPR framework as being compatible with GDPR. So as long as Japanese companies follow the procedure, they have no problem in transferring data across borders, also with the EU. I wouldn't think that it makes sense to find a sort of an Asian solution or a different concept. I think maybe GDPR is a framework that is broad enough to be applied. And since many companies, especially companies in Asia, confront the EU in one way or the other, I think they have to comply anyway. So if you introduce an Asian framework, it's just double. It would double the burden for these companies. It's like with accounting standards. No? There was US GAAP, and then there was IFRS, and now IFRS has become the standard. And Japan also has been introducing IFRS. Too many standards make things too complicated. Thank you.
I'm Roger Cole from the National Taiwan University. Thanks for your very inspiring speech. And also, thanks for introducing such a advanced concept as Society 5.0 to Taiwan. But I have a question. In your speech, you mentioned that there are some obstacles for the Society 5.0. And you mentioned all these obstacles, such as the low level of entrepreneurship or entrepreneurship, and also such as there is a strong organizational boundary in Japan, and the third, you also mentioned the lack of internationalization in Japan. And as we all know, these are long-existing problems in Japan. So I wonder how Japanese government and the civil society, how can they overcome these long-existing problems in their society? And there exists really some concrete obstacle, for all these existing social problems. So I really want to know what are the initiative or any, steps that the government and the people have showed to overcome the obstacles.
Yeah. So there's one, an interesting test case, I would say, is the startup ecosystem, which is developing in Tokyo. Also in other areas of Japan, but of course it's strongest within Tokyo. And of course, startups were confronted with lots of problems. First, there was lack of money. Then there was lack of human resources. Then there was lack of cooperation with the large organizations or with the government. And I've been conducting some research on Tokyo's startup ecosystem over the last years, and it's interesting to see that first of all, there's no longer lack of funding. There's enough money. Then even now, human resources are going into these startups because some of these young Japanese, especially engineers, even graduates from Tokyo University, they're not interested anymore in the big companies. They want the cool image of working for a startup. That's also, of course, influenced by Google and Facebook and others coming to Tokyo, opening up offices, and they had no problem acquiring Japanese talent because they had this strong brand image and this concept, this is cool to work for these people. And so there is for example, one unicorn in the area of AI, a startup called Preferred Networks. They don't seem to have problem in acquiring top students from top universities. So this is something that has changed. I don't know whether it's going to be a long trend or whether it's just limited to a small group of people, but at least things have been changing. And the other thing, there's another impressive startup in the field of health, digital health solutions. And everybody would have thought that in the field of health, you have the doctors, you have the regulations, you have the hospitals, it's so complicated. No startup can ever enter this field. There are too many obstacles. But there's this one company who just did this, and they've been very, very successful. And it turned out that because the government is interested in finding solutions, digital solutions to keep the health cost at low levels, they are welcoming these people. They're taking them serious, and they're helping them. They are open to find regulatory solutions to help their business to develop. So that's something that hasn't been seen before. Then also the distance between the large companies and the startups is also slowly melting in a way that you can see enormous increase in corporate venture capital, CVC, over the last few years, where large companies are really seeing the startups as a way to rejuvenate themselves and a way to grow and a way to increase profitability. So this little example of the startup ecosystem, the development of the startup ecosystem in Tokyo, I see it as a positive sign that there are possibilities to change. And but of course, at large, for me, the key question in Japan is mobility, cross-organizational mobility. And that can only be established by moving away from the in-house career systems that is still predominant for large organizations. Opening up the careers of managerial careers, creating an external market for managers to move across organizations. And this is something that in order to start this, and there are discussions now at Keidanren, how to break away from these in-house careers, you have to start at the entry. And the entry is the way Japanese companies are recruiting new graduates. It's a coordinated system, a one-year system of job matching between students and companies, and then at one point in time, all companies hire these people, and they are supposed to be there for the next 30 years. And to stop this system, so stop it at the entry. No? That's the shukatsu or the ikatsayo in Japan. No? If this can be stopped, then as a consequence, you will open up the markets, internal careers. No? But a long way.